What is this strange word, reconciliation? Of course, coming to work in Coventry means I've got to wrestle with the word, and I have learnt to use it less and less. Why? Because it's one of those religious words that sort of nice. Everybody approves of reconciliation. It's one of those nice things, comfortable things. You find it very hard to find people who are not impressed when you say, my job is reconciliation. But when I say it's about loving your enemies, the tone changes. People recognize this is deeply controversial, and this is profoundly difficult. Reconciliation, of course, is about healing broken relationships. And when you are up against bitterness, hatred, a history of, yes, very often murder, then reconciliation, of course, is what it's about. But it's not a theological term we're talking about. It's about taking the risk of doing precisely what Jesus did and asked his disciples to do, is to love their enemies. Probably the hardest of all the Christian commandments, if we call it that. To be reconciled with your enemy is to take an enormous risk, and in fact to make yourself deeply vulnerable. And that is what Provost Howard did in the middle of a war against Hitler's Nazi Germany. He didn't wait till the war was over. When his own cathedral was destroyed, he confronted the people of Coventry, who didn't like it one bit, with the challenge, we Christians say no to revenge, and yes to forgiveness. That was a provocation. Nobody at that moment thought of forgiving Hitler's Germany. And yet this was what Provost Howard was saying. He wasn't just saying it, he proclaimed it in practice. And the moment the war was over, when many people were saying the only good German is a dead German, he went to Hamburg, where 40,000 people had been killed by British bombing, and said, how can we help you? Not, are you willing to ask for forgiveness? No, no. How can we help you, our enemy? So the cathedral, in a sense, established its reputation on that basis. But you can't live off the past. You have to ask now, what does reconciliation mean now? And for most ordinary people, they have to apply it in their personal lives. Enemies are not just political enemies in other nations. Often enough, they're in your own family. They're very close to home. And where the hurt is deepest is where love should be strongest. And often the opposite is the case. I got involved later in one of the most exciting ventures of the cathedral, the sending of young British people to the city of Dresden, which we had destroyed in order to rebuild in communist East Germany. And I was involved in that process, helped to make it happen. I had no idea at the time that one day I would be in the staff of this cathedral, but I had that experience of East Germany, and that's one of the experiences, of course, when I came in 1986, that I was able to bring my deep knowledge, both from my birth and from my work for the British Council of Churches, my knowledge of Eastern Europe and of East Germany in particular. That enabled me to catch on to the already just beginning life of the community of the Cross of Nails in Germany, to build on that. It was quite natural for me to do that. One of the challenges that I brought to the cathedral was the question of, is military power, is the use of lethal force by a nation something that Christians can legitimately be part of? My answer to that was no. But I knew perfectly well this was not the tradition of the cathedral, this was not the tradition of the Church of England. I was a part of a, I thought, creative, challenging minority. And of course that faced me with challenges, and it faced the cathedral with challenges. That challenge was at its sharpest when HMS Coventry, a warship named after this city, was sunk in the Falklands War, and with it went a cross of nails that was on that ship. The divers went down and brought that cross up. They weren't asked to, but they discovered it and brought it up together with other things. And that cross was in the possession of the cathedral again. A new HMS Coventry was built and wanted that cross back. And I was the bearer of the cross of nails tradition, and I was asked to take that cross to a warship. Could I do that with a good conscience? I could easily have just passed it to the Dean and to John Petty and said, look, you do it. I'm a pacifist. I won't have anything to do with it. And to the horror of my pacifist friends, I took that cross to the warship, and I spoke at the time, and I said, this cross stands for a contradiction to what this ship is about. And we have to live with that contradiction. Do your best to love your enemies. And I don't think soldiers are incapable of that. In fact, there are plenty of examples where they recognize the enemy as part of the human family that they are part of. And I said, this cross is not here to bless this ship. It's here to bless you as human beings that God loves. And I had to live with that contradiction. Some people thought I should have had the courage to refuse. It wouldn't have taken much courage. That's the sort of tension that being part of this cathedral was for me. And so most of my time was spent building up this community of the Cross of Nails, this community not just in Germany, in America. And my passion was for the healing of the bitterness of South Africa. So I really planted the Cross of Nails community in South Africa. And that's become an important part of the witness of this reconciliation community, which is about loving enemies. And South Africa, of all places, was a place to do that. Very often, reconciliation work has to be done outside the glare of publicity. And building up the Cross of Nails community in Germany, which has in fact been a huge success, and in fact it's better known in Germany than in Britain. There are now, I think, about 70 Cross of Nails centres. And it was me who, when the two Germanys were reunited, said to both sides, you must now become one German Cross of Nails community and do it formally and not just informally. And so in Dresden, of all places, the Cross of Nails community for the whole of Germany, I called them from both sides to come and join. That was a very important piece of work for the cathedral, of course, but more importantly for, yes, this word reconciliation, because the tension between the two Germanys that had grown up in such different ways over 40 years was very great. And the contribution of the church, and specifically of the community of the Cross of Nails, to that very reconciliation has been very important. And so the outward symbols of that reconciliation, which we have in our wonderful statue in the ruins, that reconciliation statue of two people embracing each other, that too was part of my contribution. It was me who brought that statue to Coventry in cooperation with the School of Peace Studies at Bradford University, where the original statue is. And then I extended that together with Dean Petty and took it to Hiroshima in Japan. Again, part of my ministry, bringing what I am, and that is what ministry is all about, giving yourself. Is Christianity the only way to truly live? Is the same question put in a different way, to which I have to answer no. It is my way, it is the way God has led me, and the culture in which I grew up, which is both a Jewish and a Christian one. But it does not correspond with my actual experience. I find people in different cultures who are capable, yes, of this love for others, even for enemies. Love is the mystery. And for me personally, I discover that in its greatest perfection in Jesus. Following Jesus is difficult. It's an enormous challenge. But in the course of my ministry, one of the people with whom I actually wrote a book called What Kind of Revolution was the historian of the British Communist Party. He lived like St. Francis. He was an example to me of simple human goodness. He was not a Christian. I suppose he would have called himself an atheist. But we didn't find it difficult to jointly edit a book of essays about how to make a better world. So your question, is reconciliation solely a Christian task? I have to say no. In one sense, we have to ask the question, who is the enemy today? Where do we have to engage in the warfare of the spirit? Yes, I suppose in a Christian context, the enemy is fundamentalism. The enemy is the idea that we are right and everybody else is wrong. And fighting fundamentalism of every kind within the church, within society, is the immediate task. And it's on the increase everywhere. The negative sides of all religions are thriving. Intolerant Christianity versus intolerant Islam. And that intolerance, historically and in the present, is not a theory. It kills people on a large scale. The task of this cathedral is, among other things, a deep respect and tolerance of other religions, but first of all to recognize there is so much in Christian tradition and in our own tradition that we have to fight. In other words, the enemy is within. It's not somewhere out there. And I think we have to confront it. And here is the paradox: confront it and still love the enemy. So the task of loving ourselves is part of being a decent Christian and a decent human being. Self-hatred is often expressed in hatred of others onto whom we project our own weaknesses. So that's a universal battle in every age and in every time, but we have to define it and recognize it, and particularly in the Britain of today, recognizing a culture that becomes more and more self-centered and individualistic. I think the rejection of being part of a wider European family, which is so widespread in Britain, is one of the things the Church has to be fighting. It isn't just should we be members of the European Union or not, but are we part of this Europe that is part of our culture, our tradition, and our past? We may not like some of it, as we may not like some of ourselves, but the European question is part of the Church's task to say yes. And that immediately leads us to the question that is now flooding, yes, literally flooding across the Mediterranean, the poverty and the persecution of masses of people in the African continent who despair and look at our wealth and look at how we live and want to share it. Just as British people went all over the world to conquer it, to benefit from it. Our whole colonial history is colonizing other people for our own benefit. And now it's coming back to us. How are we going to face that as a church? I suppose the most dramatic example that I was privileged to be part of was a story of a little German village called Hohenfeld near the city of Pforzheim. Now, most British people won't know that Pforzheim was the most devastated town in Germany, much more than Dresden, even more than Hamburg. The proportion of the people of Pforzheim who were killed was the highest of any city in the Western world, killed by the Royal Air Force. Well, a few of those who went to bomb, they were actually on a reconnaissance flight after the bombing. They bailed out when their plane caught fire, and they landed near the village of Hohenfeld. And the anger of the German population about the enormous number of civilian victims a few days before was so great that, first of all, they locked these 5 British airmen up in a cellar, and then they drove them out of the cellar, and a Nazi officer gave young Hitler Youth people, 16-year-olds, told them, finish them off. And in the churchyard of that village, 5 British airmen were murdered in cold blood by young people, ordered to kill them. And that story had an immediate post-war consequence. The German officer who gave those orders was captured by the British Army, sentenced to death and executed. You might say that's the end of the story, justice. But it's the beginning of the story, because a retired German parson came to live in that village. He actually came from East Germany into this West German village because his children lived there. Years later, many years later, 30 or 40 years later, heard this story of the murder of the British airmen. And he said, this must be commemorated. We must not forget that we murdered them. And he said, we must raise a memorial to them. There was great opposition locally. People said, no, we've got a statue in our town to all the victims of the war. That's enough. These are just 5 more. He said, no, they were not victims of the war. They were murdered, and they were murdered in the churchyard of this village. And on his insistence, a plaque was put up by the church council, not the town council. The town council wouldn't do it, but the church did. And I was invited to come from Britain and preach, because of Coventry's tradition, at the unveiling of the memorial to those 5 airmen. And the widow of one of them was brought over by the Daily Mirror. And we had a most marvelous communion service. And when I was distributing communion together with the local pastor, I was giving the chalice. And a man was in tears. And I put my arms around him and I said to him, I can understand your tears. This is a very emotional occasion. And he said, no, you don't understand. I was one of those 16-year-olds who killed them. I've come for forgiveness. It was an incredible moment. And after the service, of course, I gave him communion. That was the best I could do. That was my form of giving him forgiveness. And after the service, I went to the widow of those killed, of one of those killed. And I told her this story. I said, look, one of those 16-year-olds was here. And he asked for forgiveness. And she said to me, find him so I can put my arms around him. And he couldn't be found. He'd gone away quietly. And nobody knew him. He no longer lived in the village. So she wasn't able to put her arms around him. But what was the result of all that? When the story was published in Britain, the commander of the plane that flew over the village, who survived and came home because he couldn't jump out of the plane, his parachute was defective, and somehow he got his plane back to England. He didn't even know some of his crew had been murdered. The RAF never told him. And he read that story 40 years later. And he wrote to the village pastor and to the mayor and said, can I do something for your village? You've put up a memorial to my crew. And the village wrote back, we're just building a new kindergarten for our little children. Send a gift to them. And so he ordered a Welsh rocking horse to be made. And he brought the rocking horse. And the German children rode the Welsh rocking horse. And the rocking horse was called Hope. And ever since that day, the children of that village and the children of the Welsh village, where that officer now lived in retirement, have exchanged families. That's reconciliation. After that story of murder, that to this day, the families of those two villages have become friends and exchanged their children. What makes Britain great? Well, people would no longer say an empire. People today would say winning 2 world wars. This identifies almost British identity. Icon figures like Churchill become symbols of, we stood out against Hitler, we won the First World War, and the huge commemorations of both those wars. We've just gone through the first one because it was a century. The second one was 75 years. You know, I find the iconization of war as the identity of a nation a tragedy. Of course, commemoration in the sense of seeing war as a tragedy and even recognizing that within the tragedy a lot happens that is not just bad but also good. That's a reality of war. I wish we could find symbols of greatness that were not how successfully we killed. And of course, at that point, I become a German again, because I recognize, and the Cross of Nails community in Germany reflects that in many ways. German children are taught in school of the terrible things that Germans did to their fellow human beings. In Britain, we're not told that Britain invented concentration camps in South Africa in the Boer War, that we built concentration camps in Kenya and tortured and murdered the Kikuyu people. The black side of British history is not taught in British schools. The black side of German history is taught in German schools. Be true to yourself. Be true to the Jesus that you know, because each of us knows our own Jesus. In other words, the experience of God, however we define it, is something very, very personal, and yet, personal as it is, it's shared with many others, so it becomes part of the whole. So I'm just so happy that the cathedral once again has a dedicated team who go back to the roots of the cathedral itself, go back to this remarkable tradition established by the first two provosts, the wartime provost and the post-war provost, two very different men, but two very great people with great gifts. What the cathedral probably still has to learn, and hadn't learnt in its heyday under Provost Williams, its glorious days. It was very much on its own. It was very much a cathedral driving its own convictions, its own way, and not part of anything else. It was even on the edge of the Church of England. The cathedral has got to be seen to be genuinely international, genuinely ecumenical, that is, seeing itself as part of a wider church that is not just Church of England. And I think everybody who works here has got to work in that wider framework, wider and paradoxically narrower. The cathedral has also got to become ingrained in this city, and not just there for the wide world. And I would say, as a sort of a sign-off, if we still think we can be a respectable nation and be prepared to use nuclear weapons if the test comes and become mass murderers, which is the present consensus, we need this Trident missile. Not for military purposes, but to demonstrate our potential power. And that is to create another Holocaust if anybody touches us. If we're prepared to do that, we've surrendered our humanity and not only our Christianity. It's as dire as that. And the context that I haven't mentioned so far, which is now inescapable, and we're going to be taught that by the Pope, if by nobody else, is that if we don't live differently to preserve our planet, if we don't consume so much and put back into nature what we've taken out of it, we will not survive. We've talked about so many things, but what's religion got to do with it all? Faith, hope and love, which are at the heart of my relationship to Jesus, has everything to do with it. But that wasn't your question. The question you asked me, what's religion got to do with it? Faith is a very deep personal thing. Religion is a social phenomenon. I think I can say I hope I become more and more deeply rooted in faith and in trust that there is a God, but I can't define God. God is a mystery. I see God reflected in Jesus, reflected in love in all sorts of different ways. In spirit, I'm still here. I've never gone away. Coventry Cathedral takes hold of you. It becomes a very profound experience. Partly the beauty of the place. I think the outward shell has an inward resonance. The work of artists who express in their art what it's all about becomes part of you, and it becomes part of your prayer life. You can't shake it off. Probably the thing that stays part of me most is the two great works of Jacob Epstein that I think are even greater than the wonderful tapestry of Christ in glory. Christ bound before Caesar, Christ the victim, as all the people of the world are so often victims. And that figure of Jesus before Pilate in our ruins was Jacob Epstein's favorite work of art. He couldn't part with it. It stood in his garden till he died. It's the only thing that was not created for Coventry Cathedral, but his widow gave it after his death. But what he did create for Coventry Cathedral was the remarkable work that shows the Archangel Michael and the devil. And when he was given the commission, it was after a real debate in the group that decided what art was going into the cathedral. And they had to have St. Michael and the devil, because that's the cathedral's symbol. Who was going to do it? Who was going to do it? And the suggestion was it should be Jacob Epstein. And quite a number of people around the table, the bishop was chairing, said, but that would not really be appropriate. After all, he was a Jew. There was a long silence. And the bishop just said, like Jesus. And the matter was settled. Michael is the epitome of humanity. Compassionate. And the spear he's holding is pointed upwards and not downwards to the devil. And the devil is a suffering human being. In other words, both Michael and the devil are us. The devil is our negative side, pleading, because the devil is looking up to Michael, and Michael is not destroying this broken part of humanity. It's a very different imagery than you usually get of the devil being destroyed by Michael. Michael is compassionate, and the devil is pleading for compassion. It's quite an extraordinary image. Yes, what do I take back, having left Coventry? Those images, which are at the heart of my Christian faith, and of course the human beings whom I love. Only a few in their hearts carried this international ministry of reconciliation with me. I often felt very lonely, and I think my predecessors and successors felt the same. That it's very difficult when you have a mission, and you really see it as a God-sent mission, to have the ability, as well as doing the actual work, to take others with you on the work. And I often felt, if only they understood. But Jesus must constantly have felt that about the people around him. Even the 12 didn't usually understand what it was all about. So there was a certain loneliness in this ministry, that despite the community of the cathedral, you had to live with a certain inner loneliness. I was often at the edge, but I saw that as part of my vocation.